Mr. Craven from the NET English Director Team. I'm here with Mr. Kofi, also from the Director Team. And today we're going to be discussing Shelley's poem Ozymandias, with our key question being essentially, what is Shelley's message here? So first question, why is this an interesting, or at least a useful poem, do you think?
Well, first, it's one of my favourite poems.
I didn't know that. Good.
Yeah.
Right.
I think mainly because of the simplicity of the message. I think it's quite obvious that it's a poem about kind of the corruptive nature of power. It's essentially a poem about arrogance, human arrogance, and the impact that can have, but also the lack of impact it can have as well. The kind of power of humanity and how we think sometimes that we're greater than we are, and then nature outlasts us, and we become irrelevant, which I think is quite kind of pertinent to today as well as it was when it was written back in the Georgian period.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So in terms of looking back then to the context of the poem, right? So Shelley, the poet, is it relevant to the poem to understand him and his context, do you think?
I think it helps to know something about him. I wouldn't say you need to, but the fact that he is a romantic poet.
So, okay, so just unpack that for us. So he's a romantic poet. What is a romantic poet? What does that mean?
Well, what it doesn't mean is that he's kind of interested in love and he's buying boxes of chocolates and wine, that kind of thing. It's not that kind of romance.
Yeah.
The kind of romantic poet we're talking about is the late 18th, 19th century, where it was more a focus on nature and the power of nature, the transcendent power of nature, and you had a group of poets who essentially were rejecting kind of the urban lifestyle that was being fed to them, and they believed that there was something else to kind of go after, which was essentially social justice, the rights of women, the working class, and it was more kind of a concern with emotion and an emotional experience over kind of reason.
So romantic originally was am I right in thinking it was a criticism, wasn't it? They were just fanciful, ridiculous, not grounded on this earth, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So that's Shelley. So the poem's called Ozymandias. Now Ozymandias was a real historical figure, wasn't he?
Yes. He was. Well, Ramesses II was a kind of a leader from Egypt, a very historical figure, and the subject matter is real. There was an actual statue that was found, and that's what inspired Shelley to write his poem. I believe it was him and another poet who had a kind of writing competition between the two of them.
Oh, right.
So who was going to write the better poem?
Okay. I'm assuming Shelley won.
Obviously Shelley won,
right,
because we're still reading about him in the AQA anthology.
Yeah.
I don't know the other poem, so I'm assuming it's not as good.
It's another sonnet, actually. It's quite similar, I believe.
Right.
Yes.
Interesting.
But irrelevant to this conversation.
Yes.
Yes, go on.
So it was a very real statue. I believe Shelley was inspired by kind of a report of them finding the statue. But also I think it kind of links again to that whole kind of romantic idea of kind of a rejection of the power of humanity to kind of build. And Ramesses II was very much famed for his building. He built lots and lots, kind of as kind of an homage to himself, which the statue was. So it was a very real statue, a very real inspiration for Shelley, and I think a very real message he wanted to make through that as well.
Okay, thank you. So in simple terms, students often then view this poem as being just about a statue falling apart in the desert. That's the simple version of it I often find in essays and things. Is that right?
It is about a statue in the desert, but there's very much there's a symbolic message behind that, which is about, again, the power of humanity over the power of nature. I think you think about the last line of the poem and about how it represents the sand stretching far away, whereas the statue has been broken apart. So I think that the main symbolic message of this statue is that whatever our achievements might be as human beings, they don't last, particularly when they're done with the kind of arrogance that Ramesses II had. Whatever kind of name we try to make for ourselves, putting ourselves on a pedestal, which he literally did,
literally and metaphorically.
Nice. That pedestal will always crumble.
Okay, so linking to that then in terms of Shelley's context. So we're in the middle of the Georgian period. We've had the Napoleonic Wars in living memory. Britain's lost the American War of Independence. Britain's seen as the workshop of the world. It's the international policeman. It's a bit like America is now, isn't it? That kind of view internationally. We've got countries across the globe being ruled as part of the British Empire. Are those contexts relevant to the poem, do you think? And to religious dominance and political dominance. Is that some of what Shelley's talking about? Is that relevant?
I think so. I think he was looking at the British Empire and the kind of religious context that he was in, and I think he was looking at it and thinking this won't last. He was an atheist himself, and so and he references kind of this biblical allusion throughout the poem. I think he was looking at that, the situation with the British Empire, the American, and saying that arrogance that came with that, where people feeling we are the dominant kind of group of people. And obviously he was right in a sense. There's a lot of those crumbled, and I think he was almost predicting that. He was kind of looking back at history and looking at his day and saying, actually, whatever human achievements we make, they, again, it's that kind of the arrogance of humanity where that will eventually crumble. So I think he kind of predicted quite a few of those kind of crumblings of society.
But very much making a broader point rather than just being about that.
Yeah.
That kind of influences it, just not the whole story.
Definitely.
Lovely. Now, several of the poems that we study in the anthology, the interpretation of them can change over time. Do you think that's true of this one, in terms of this story about the inscription on the statue, where Shelley's intending us to view it as just overweening arrogance and flawed? Do you think we interpret it as a modern audience the same way that Shelley intended? Has our view of it changed, do you think?
I think our view of it will be similar, but I do also think that, we think about our context today, we've got kind of these leaders like Trump and Johnson. I think there's a relevance there that we kind of look at and think, well, there's the leaders who kind of set themselves up again on a pedestal, leaders who rule with a very kind of almost kind of very with arrogance. We say, well, that will crumble. But I do think as well, people at the time of production would have very much seen the same message. I think that message, much like, well, I suppose it's similar to the statue. It kind of there's something still there, even if it's kind of changed over time.
There's universality to the message, which has lasted.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of the way he's written the poem, then, so the way he's written, the way he structured it, does that link to what he's trying to describe? Do you think is there a relevance to the form of it?
Definitely. Yeah, I think the fact that he's written it as a sonnet is important. The fact that it's written in iambic pentameter, I think he's...
Sorry, so just, what is a sonnet then, in simple terms?
So a sonnet's 14 lines long. It's usually references love. It's usually a love poem, which is a very old-fashioned style. It's very outdated, particularly in this time.
So when Shelley was writing, it was already like an old-fashioned...
It was already old-fashioned, yeah. So the fact that he's writing with that would have stuck out. People would have read this at the time and thought, why is he writing essentially an old-fashioned version? And
so why do you think that is? Why is he writing this old-fashioned style poem?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if he did that because he was kind of deliberately wanting to reference an old, outdated thing. The fact that the statue and Ramesses and Ozymandias, they are old and outdated, and he's kind of bringing back that sense of both mystery and history in the way he's written it. That was a deliberate...
That's a lovely phrase. We'll pick up on,
and again, iambic pentameter, which is where you have 10 syllables in a line, and that's how sonnets will be written, and it kind of goes up at the end. Again, I'm wondering whether that was also kind of referencing a more historic style, but also the kind of neat structure, which perhaps references Ozymandias and his building and wanting things to be perfect.
It's almost a shape doesn't fall apart at the end, doesn't it?
Yes.
That's symbolic.
I know, yes, we've improved his poems.
So this idea of sonnets then, because so traditionally they were about love, weren't they? That was kind of the focus. Is that relevant to this, do you think? Or is it simply the form he's using?
I think it's relevant, but perhaps not in the way sonnets were intended. Usually sonnets, you wrote to someone you loved and you write a lovely sonnet on Valentine's Day, etc. But actually this is more of a poem of self-love. It's more of a almost referencing like a sonnet to himself, Ozymandias, that he's kind of, look at me, I'm the king of kings, look upon my works, ye mighty in despair. He's almost kind of saying, I'm brilliant, aren't I worthy of worship? And it's kind of, again, a love poem to himself.
Okay. So in terms of central images in the poem, I mean, I suppose the two key ones, there's the statue itself, isn't there? And there's the sand. How are we supposed to interpret those two things, do you think?
I think, obviously, sand and the statue, sand and stone are made of the same substance, aren't they, really? I know we're going to science here, so we won't go too far. But for me, I think they ultimately represent the statue representing the power of humanity, the sand representing the power of nature. And again, the fact that we have this statue that's broken down and we end with that line about the sand, I think emphasizes that nature has won, really, that nature continues, and that essentially what's happening is the statue's becoming sand as well. That it's kind of going, it's that whole, again, to quote the Lion King, it's the circle of life.
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah, absolutely.
That everything goes back into itself.
Is there also an argument that sand could be a symbol of time, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you think about those old-fashioned, we'll have to explain this for students who've never seen one.
The hourglass.
The hourglass, where you have the sands of time. And again, time's a key theme throughout this poem. The idea that, something that happened both that something happened thousands of years ago would still be relevant to us, but also the power over time. Nature destroying that statue didn't happen within a day. Ramesses II or Ozymandias would have destroyed an army in a day, but over time, slowly that wind would have eroded that statue. And again, it's that the passage of time being so important, I think.
Yeah. Lovely. So in terms of then, there's lots of things to look out for. What are the things that trip people up on this poem? What are the problems? What are the stumbling blocks, do you think?
I think the fact that the poem is written in the third person, but also it's kind of a reference to somebody. I met a traveller first person, but then he's referencing somebody else, and he's referencing something else, and it's almost that kind of almost Chinese whispers, really, where I met someone who saw this, and he said this, and actually it questions the validity of what he's seeing.
So we start with Shelley, don't we?
Yeah,
probably as a narrator. We've seen this first person Shelley. Then we meet this traveller, and we get the traveller's account, don't we? And then we get this account of the statue the traveller has come across in the desert. Yeah. Right. So why do that? So it's about questioning validity, you think?
I think so. I think it's one of those, it creates a sense of mystery around the poem, I think. It's kind of, and I think that would have intrigued the audience at the time production. This is a time before airplanes and people hearing stories a lot. They would have heard about Egypt and this mystical land they would have maybe read about in the Bible at the time. But the fact that he's kind of, I've met someone who, and this. But also I think it's important in terms of like the fact that he's anonymous, the person who he's talking to. And it's that sense of, Ozymandias, who is anonymous as well as being world famous, it was also somebody who we don't really know about until we read the poem, and that references the poem, and that he was somebody who was well known now but isn't anymore.
And I suppose that's that half sunk, shattered visage, isn't it? That kind of face disappearing, fading over time. As you were saying. Okay, so in terms then of interpretations of the poem, I came across an answer from a student in which their line of argument was that what Shelley is writing about in the poem is, yes, the statue in the desert, but really he's talking about art and the lasting impact of art and so on. Is that a valid interpretation, do you think, or is that a misconception? I
think to an extent I can see where that's coming from, in that that there is you could say that there's something lasting, but it hasn't really, has it? It's destroyed. So there is a half, the half visage, there's still something there.
But I suppose his idea that the sculptor's work has outlasted the king.
Yes, yeah.
In a weird sort of way, the king, who's the powerful one, has dictated to the sculptor what to do, but actually the sculptor is the one whose work has lasted and outlasted the king. Is that, do you think?
Kind of. I think if you think back to My Last Duchess as well, you've got that the power of the painter, and the painter has produced something so powerful that it almost seems like it's real life. I think in that sense that the painter's kind of the powerful one you could interpret, and the sculptor here, the one who created this statue, and actually it questions again, like you find with artwork or propaganda, someone who's you create a statue of someone, you're glorifying that, or you're attempting to glorify them when everybody knows, well, that's not what he would have looked like, or how he would have acted. And perhaps is there a question there about the validity of the sculptor as well.
And I suppose if we extend that forwards from the sculptor, we've got Shelley himself as the poet.
Yeah.
So is Shelley actually talking about him? Is this an ego trip for Shelley?
Could be. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I suppose a line of argument that could be, couldn't it? That ultimately students now, they don't know who Ozymandias was or Ramesses II. They do know who Shelley is and Ozymandias the poem because they had to study it. Yeah. So actually, weirdly, it's the poem that's outlasted the statue that's outlasted the king.
Yeah, it's again circle of life.
Okay, so in terms of where we arrive in this poem, in a few of the poems that we look at, there's a very clear sense of direction from the start to the finish, and we arrive somewhere. Do you think that's true of this one? Do we arrive somewhere different from where we start?
I don't think we do. I think we end up where we start. It's very cyclical, this poem, in that we start with him being, I met a traveller from an antique land, and he's in the desert, and then ends with the sand of the desert. So it's that sense of, as powerful as Ozymandias was, and as great as the statue was, we're left in the same place we were originally. And again, that sense of eternity and that sense of nature, which obviously the Romantics would have wanted to promote, nature outlasting us, and us coming right back to where we started again. So even though things happened in the middle, actually we end up right back where we started in one sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding kind of truth in nature about that, nature inspiring kind of that realisation for humanity. Yeah. Okay, so to move from that, so students sometimes make some really odd choices of comparison at this point. So what have you come across in terms of interesting examples, and what would you compare it to?
I think students often want to compare this poem to any of the war poems because it's often the ones they know best, Remains being a typical one.
Yeah.
But actually, as hard as you try to fit it, this poem isn't about war. It is about nature, it is about humanity, it is about power.
So how do you make it fit Remains?
Well, you could make it fit Remains in terms of memories and the passage of time. Okay. That would work.
I suppose the image of sand.
Yes, if you do it well, yes.
Yeah. I think, but that's a stretch. Do you think that's?
I think it's a stretch. I think you'd have to know what you're doing with the poems to do that, and it would obviously depend on the topic of the question as well. Some people just see the name of the poem and say, right, I'll link it to this, and without thinking, hang on, what am I actually being asked?
For the full cover. Okay. Yeah. So where would you go with the comparison? What would your top choice be, and what else might be possible?
I think My Last Duchess would be my top choice. Okay. When you look at Ozymandias as a character, and you look at the Duke as a character, they're very, very similar. Yeah. They're very tyrannical, very dominant. They're using people, and there's that sense of the artist as well, as we talked about. Yeah. So I think for me, My Last Duchess would always be a clear comparative point. You could do nature as well, and some nature poems, Storm on the Island, perhaps, in terms of, again, you've got the arrogance of humanity, we are prepared, and then the huge nothing we fear, and the whole kind of power of nature again coming in there. Exposure as well, obviously, in terms of the power of nature and mankind. So that's
Storm on the Island. I mean, would you say that actually there's a link, isn't it, in terms of the power of nature? The view of people, then, would you say that's the same, or is that different?
I'd say similar and different. I think the thing about these people is that they are, they are prepared. They are they build their houses squat, and I do think there's a sense of arrogance there. But they do last. They're still there at the end. Whereas obviously with Ozymandias, he eventually is destroyed. Yeah. So I think yes and no. I mean,
you'd almost think about the individual and the group, couldn't you? In terms of
yes, definitely. Yeah.
And the exposure, kind of that same idea of the power of nature over the individual.
Yes.
Group links into that.
Yeah.
I can see it, absolutely. Now, Ozymandias is a poem that's had quite a major cultural impact. You've been referenced in popular shows like Breaking Bad, Ozymandias, and in terms of Watchmen, there's a character called Ozymandias. What is it about it, do you think, that's going to grab people's imagination?
I think it's, again, that sense of a single dominant figure who's taking over. Yeah. And I think you watch any TV show or read any book or watch any movie, and there's always that sense of we want the high and mighty to fall, particularly if they're arrogant. We're waiting for that fall, and I think with Ozymandias we get that fall, and there's a satisfaction there. So I think it speaks to us kind of today as much as it would have done when Shelley wrote it, in that we see that same character again and again, not just called Ozymandias, but called, I won't mention certain names, but other people you might know, or people that in the news that you think, well, there's a fall coming.
That sort of hubris that we're waiting for them to fall down.
Absolutely. Yeah. And often they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So to bring this around to sort of conclusion, I mean, if you could only make 3 points about this poem, what would your 3 key takeaway points be? I'm choosing 3 completely arbitrarily.
No, I think, well, obviously I'd go with the dominance of maybe the power of humanity. I'd go with power of humanity.
So that flawed sense of dominance.
Yes, particularly from a single character.
Yeah.
I'd go with the passage of time, power of time, and also the power of nature.
Yeah.
I think that would kind of be my 3 main points I'd go to.
Okay. And if you could only choose one key quotation from this poem, what would you go for, and why?
I mean, there's the one that most people know, which is obviously, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, the poem works in mighty in despair. But I wouldn't go for that one. I would probably reference it, but the last line I think is powerful, more powerful. The lone level sands stretch far away. Yeah. Purely on the basis of, you can look at that from a structural standpoint as well. That being the last line, and that it's almost like nature has the last word and the last say. You've got that lovely kind of the sound of the lone and level, that alliteration, the kind of L, which kind of again lengthens that last line, almost makes it stand out even more.
I suppose under the sand and the stretch with the sibilants there.
Yeah,
because I mean both those sounds they're continuous sounds, aren't they?
Yes,
which flow onwards, which is quite neat.
Yeah,
absolutely. So on a personal level, I always like the half sunk and shattered visage lies. I like the idea of kind of that sinking away, that half broken, half shattered, half forgotten.
Yeah,
I quite like that as a symbol as well.
Yeah, okay, brilliant.
And as a penultimate question then, if you had to design a dream question for the exam, for this poem, what would it be, and which other poem would you write about as part of that question?
I think I would look at the power of humanity. I think you could go a lot of ways from there. So I think, compare how do poets present the power of humanity in Ozymandias and one of the poem of your choice? Again, I choose Milas Duchess, and I'd look at kind of, again, arrogance. I could then link it to nature as well. And that's what I think students have to remember is whatever the question is, you can always link it to your own ideas as long as it's relevant. So nature and humanity are two different sides. You could look at time would come in as well. So those 3 points I mentioned earlier, I think would link really nicely to that question.
Absolutely. My final question was going to be, where do you stand? What is Shelley trying to say? And I think you kind of answered that.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you very much. Right, that's it for this podcast. Huge thanks to Mr. Kofi for taking the time to discuss this with us. And as ever, do talk to your teachers and to members of the English Director team if you have any questions, queries, comments or concerns. Thank you for listening.